Thanks for joining us on the episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. If you've been wondering what's been happening to us the last couple of weeks due to some releases or late releases, here's the update. We're not done recording and putting out podcasts.
We're back. Back and better than ever.
So a couple of things. So in December, we had 5 Mondays.
5 Mondays in December. Yeah.
And so we're going to have 5 episodes and get a 53rd extra bonus episode for the last year. However, our host didn't like that because of our limitations on the amount we can upload per month. So I waited until January 1st to upload it. And we put it out in January, which that's the way it goes. Then last week, we didn't have an episode because, well, we've had a lot going on. Some of us,
to say the least.
Some of us have been in, I don't know, the other part of the world.
The other side and other pole of the world. As far away as you can get.
Other of us were just not interested. So, so that's it. So we're back at it, but our first real episode of the new year, this is it, I would say.
At least we're beginning a new series.
Yes. And a new season. This is season 8 of the After Class Podcast. So I find that really remarkable that we've been able to keep going. Every year I'm like, is this going to be it? You know, are we going to keep the momentum? But we've been able to keep the momentum, and I'm really happy about that. But it's a new semester, get off on a new semester. This is week 1 of spring 25. I don't know. I think the most interesting thing, though, has to do with you, John, and why you were unavailable for us to record here for a couple weeks.
Yeah, I think I previewed this in a previous episode.
Yeah, I think
probably
we
mentioned it.
Yeah, my daughter and I went to Australia for 2 weeks, and so that left little room for recording.
Yeah, we weren't going to make you have to record it, 5 in the morning just to suit our schedules.
Yeah. And it was, I'm telling you, it was a trip to remember.
I can only imagine.
It was. We were so blessed. Abby Weller, an alumnus of Great Lakes, her and her husband lived there, and boy, she was off of work. They just began their summer break, and she's a teacher there, so she's on summer break, and so she said, "Now's a great time to come," and so we basically had a 2-week vacation tour of Australia, which is pretty remarkable. And Abby just did it. She was so hospitable. She did a great job of just mapping out a perfect experience for us. We had times of hanging out in the city of what we would say is Melbourne, what they say Melbourne.
Oh,
so
Melbourne.
There's not a lot of pronunciation of the R's in a lot of words. They just drop off Melbourne.
Good to know.
Yeah, and so the third leg of our trip was in a city that we would call Cairns, but they drop the R and it becomes Cairns. So I learned a lot about Australian culture and language, and all that really fascinates me. But spent some great time in the city of Melbourne and in the parks nearby, and getting to know the local flora and fauna. Quality time with some kangaroos, both in the wild and in like petting zoo context where you can kind of be up close and personal with them.
All right, don't hate me for this, but did you try kangaroo meat?
No, it was never on the menu anywhere we went.
Oh, man, I would absolutely try that if I had the opportunity.
The highlight of my kangaroo experience, besides in the wild in this park, we saw a pack of kangaroos in Australia are like deer are in Lansing.
Oh, okay.
It's just
Oblivious to the world.
they, if you drive by a field at night, you're going to see deer.
Yeah.
And if you get close, they're going to run away. And you're going to see, sometimes you'll see a handful of them, sometimes you'll see like a pack of 20.
Yeah.
And that's the way kangaroos are in Australia. If you're going to see animals out in the field, it's not going to be deer, it's going to be kangaroos. And so we got to watch some box. Some kangaroos just playing in I don't know if they were fighting or playing, but they were exchanging blows with their fists and like standing back up on their tail, which is pretty wild to watch.
That is wild.
That is really cool.
But in the zoo context where we got to be close to them, the coolest part is we got to watch a mama kangaroo with a joey in her pouch, and the joey climbs out, kind of takes a look, and like, nah, I don't like what's going on here, and climbs back in. But I was telling people over lunch, like, it's not like the pictures where you see like this head of a baby kangaroo sticking out of the pouch, it's just hanging out there. It's like when they climb in, it's just like there's like a foot sticking out that you can see. They're just in there in the weirdest angle. They're just sloppily hanging in that pouch.
That's funny.
It's not like neatly tucked with their butts down and their heads up. It's just like, no, they're just in there, and you don't know. There'd be sprawling legs, maybe part of a tail sticking out or an ear. But it was so
I love
cool.
that.
There was all sorts of wildlife that we never experienced here. They had things that look like porcupines, but they're not. They're like the quills don't come out, but they're like spiky like that.
Oh, okay.
Do they have anything akin to poison ivy or poison oak over there?
Apparently, we walked through 2 different rainforests. One was a tropical kind of wet, warm rainforest, and one's more temperate rainforest, more dry, and more cool. And like, there's like, just don't touch anything because anything can kill you. Like there are plants you can't touch because they'll kill you, and there are like insects you don't want to touch you because they'll kill you, and there are things in the water that you don't want to touch your skin because it'll kill you. Like,
oh my gosh!
Wow.
Now we didn't come close to death at any point, but we didn't like walk through the woods. We stayed on the trails, and when we saw a neat plant, we just took a picture. We didn't like, hey, let me rub it against my cheek.
Yeah, that's the way to go.
That would be hard for me because my natural instinct is to get off the trail wherever I am. And so to be told you can't get off the trail or you will die, that's about what it's going to take to make me.
Not you will, but you could.
You could.
You
It's
could
a
do
metaphor
something.
for the Christian faith.
There you go.
Exactly.
You got great material there for preaching now. So
But it was parts of this trip were a lot like the Hawaii trip, which you went on with Simon and Lindsay.
yeah.
Where they took us on so many hikes, and
Yep.
it's like Hawaii is the opposite. Like there's no predators on the island.
Right, yeah.
Like there's really just one thing you have to avoid: the centipede.
The centipedes.
Oh,
Yeah.
not
And
the
they still
lava.
don't, and they
And
don't
the
even
lava.
kill you. Well, if you're on
Sorry.
the Big Island, sure, yeah.
Yeah, we went to Kauai.
Yeah.
But like there, it's like the safest place to be out in nature. Like there's
Yeah.
nothing you have to worry about. Here, it's kind of like you gotta know what you're doing, or you gotta stay to the path.
Everything wants to kill you in Australia, huh? That's funny.
So, but lots of hiking, like waterfalls and gorges and rivers and rocks and climbing through rocks and paths, and that was a blast. We drove along the south coast. It's called the Great Ocean Road,
Okay.
where you just got to see the ocean. Every time you go around a bend, and there's another majestic view of the ocean.
Wow.
Climb up a lighthouse and look out, and there's this thing called the 12 Apostles, which I thought was an interesting name.
I've actually seen pictures of that, obviously.
Yeah. And it's just a bunch of like towering clumps of rock just standing out. I don't know, 100 yards from the shore, like scattered out. And I guess they used to be part of the cliff, but as it eroded back, you just have these like stone pillars. And there's now like 8 apostles. I think 12 of them have drowned, gone
Martyrdom
under.
has taken their lives, huh?
But
yeah.
But I really enjoyed it. We walked along treetops. There was like paths connecting treetops in the forest, like towers, and you can like see over the forest, and so many cool experiences. But up in Cairns, we got to go on a charter boat out to the Great Barrier Reef, where my daughter and Abby snorkeled, and I was able to scuba, which was amazing. And of course, the highlight for me in the scuba trip was seeing a shark, like swimming close to a shark and just watch it roaming around doing its thing and feeling like, I can't believe I'm down here with a shark. It was really cool.
Wasn't a great white, though. You didn't get to see a great white.
No, I think it was a white-tipped reef shark, but probably like, I don't know, 4 to 5 feet long. It looked very sharky.
Did you try any shark meat while you're there? Sorry, I
not that
thought I'd
either.
ask about all the meats.
I don't think I ate any exotic meats.
Oh, man.
I ate a lot of Australian cuisine. The food is not radically different than the States. A lot of Australian culture actually reminds me a lot of the States.
Oh, okay.
It feels like you're in Hawaii. It's different, but it still feels very much like American. Although they
Okay.
have certain things that are really cool, like their shopping carts are omnidirectional. I love those. I guess I love going shopping because, like, if you were coming head on with this old lady with a big bag of groceries, you can just sidestep, just slide horizontally. You don't have to like and try to contort it to get around in 3-point turns with your shopping cart, like here in the States.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, lots of little cultural things that I just found interesting.
Australians are better at engineering shopping carts, is what it sounds like. So
Yes, they are.
Good for them.
Yeah, and I love the way they do money is so much better because the price you see on the menu is what you're going to pay.
Oh, I love that. I hate
Yeah.
taxes.
That would be
The
fantastic.
tax is baked into it already, so you don't have to calculate that.
Right.
And tips, you don't have to worry about tips anywhere in the country because the people in the service industries that we normally tip get paid a livable wage.
Oh, that must be nice of them.
It's just a different paradigm,
yeah.
right?
Right,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Just pay them more.
Hmm.
And any expenses that need to be passed on to the customers get worked into the one bill. What's even
Cost
better,
of-
so $20 meal costs $20, not $20
Right, yeah.
plus tax plus tip, and then all of a sudden it's $28.
Yeah.
But for an American, it's even better because a $20 meal, the way the conversion rate is, it's 60 cents to the dollar. So
Oh, wow.
so when I go for a $20 meal there and I scan my little Apple card, it shows up on my bill as $12.
That is fantastic.
So instead of
My
moving up to being $28, it goes down to being 12. So it's a favorable time to be an American with a credit card there.
No kidding. That's terrific.
Anyway, great time. The hospitality from Abby and her husband Andrew was phenomenal. Lots of time on the beach and in the mountains and in the water, and good time had by all. And Lexi and I didn't get sick one bit on the trip, which was great.
That's great.
My back went out just on one flight, which was the flight back from Northern Australia to Southern Australia, and I just spent a day in bed that we had nothing planned. So that was a great day for my back to go out. I made it home. Jet lag is real. It's the first time in my life I've experienced it. It took me 3 days to get back.
I could see it in you. Like Monday, we were all back in the office, and just talking with you, it's like John's not in America yet.
Yeah, you told me, John, you realize you keep yawning.
Yeah, you were just really off,
Yeah.
which I understand. Coming back, it's hard on the body. So I'm not surprised it took you a few days to get
And then after work, I had like an 18 long straight migraine that didn't break until yesterday at 3. So anyway,
brutal.
so yeah, it was really fun, and and back in Michigan, there's been snow.
Significant.
Nonstop snow now for several days, which I'm happy for. People think I'm weird, but I'm looking out the windows. Right now it's not snowing, but when I look out the windows and I see snow coming down, I am happy. All I want to do is get out and go for walks in the woods or get in my truck and drive because I like snow. This is why I live in Michigan. But coming back from Australia to the teens and the temperature and the snow, that was probably a little bit of a shock to the system, I would have to imagine.
Yeah, but I like it. I like snow. I don't mind cold when there's snow. We've talked about this.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But next week's supposed to be single-digit highs.
It's gonna be exciting. Very
yeah,
exciting.
it's going to be
Yeah.
brutally cold next week.
Yeah.
Bring it on.
Okay.
Bring it on.
Okay.
Settle down there.
Slow your
Ron.
roll.
Settle down.
Well, with that, we start a new season of podcasts and a new series. We finished up the Micah series. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you should go back and listen, I guess. We're going to start a series. Should we tell them what the series is going to be about?
Sure.
Or should we
Yeah.
get into that?
Go for it.
You may or may not recall that John has written a book in the last year, Priestly Presence, and we're just going to go through that about the argument that he makes and about the implications it might have for churches around the world, but especially in America, and perhaps how they've missed it in certain places and what we might do to regain an appropriate, I think, presence and influence in the world. So we're going to go through the book little by little and see what he has to say.
Yeah, I like the premise of it because I think it really helps us to understand what it means to be Christians. What does it mean to be God's people in the earth? And there are a lot of competing arguments, theologically, biblically, different people have different ideas of what it means to be a Christian. And that's really important because that affects every part of our life. I'm a Christian at home, at work, out in public. There are all these different areas where we all can agree that our commission is to represent God to the world. But the question is, at a practical level, how do we do that? And what is really the vision that Jesus has given us that builds upon the vision that God's given to his people going back to the Old Testament? And I think that this book says, all right, we're going to take a look at this from a biblical point of view and say, let's understand that vision. Let's understand that commission that we've gotten from God so that we can know how to respond to these various things that we're facing. And so I'm looking forward to having this conversation.
Yeah. Long-term listeners may remember, I think it was in our first season that we went over Endangered Gospel,
Yep.
It's pretty early on, yeah.
how fixing the world is killing the church is the
Right.
subtitle. And that church was really, that book was really meant to let's ground the church's nature and mission in the full Bible story. That was the purpose of that book. And the thing that people most took away from that is the need for a renewed commitment to their church family. Like God's strategy, his mission in the world has revolved around a set-apart people. And that set-apart people's mission to the world is contingent upon them living extraordinary lives together of love, of fellowship, of friendship, of family commitment to one another, and that our witness to the world grows out of this deep commitment and fellowship with one another. And so some people left that book saying, yeah, I got a lot on the church's, life in-house, but I don't feel like I got enough about the church's witness to the wider world. So in many ways, this project builds on that earlier one. So if you want to know what Endangered Gospel is all about, of course you can read the book, or you can go back to season 1 and we kind of go through it. And it's not like in that series we just sat and read pages and talked about them. It's more like the themes of the chapters we bring up, and then we have our normal, 3-pronged, 3-perspective, 3-headed dragon conversation about it. And that's the way this is going to be. It's not going to be like talking about the content of the chapter per se, but like bringing up the outline and then engaging some of the big ideas together. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is particularly relevant and germane to our time and place. We live in a world where in the last little bit, especially with the elections and COVID and on it goes, there have been a lot of things that have sent churches and people in churches to all sorts of places and sides and staked claims in different areas. And unfortunately, that has not been a great look for the church and for Christianity in America. And so this is a very appropriate type of conversation that I hope many churches are having right now, because we've got to figure something out because we're losing whatever battle we're fighting.
Yeah. Before we get into that, I just want to say if you want to read along with us and kind of follow the conversation along with us, the book retails for $34, or on Amazon you can get it for $13.73. 2-day delivery if you have Amazon Prime, which is $10 cheaper than I was able to get it for. Like when they first published it, I'm like, I want a batch, and they're like, we'll give you the author discount. And I bought like 50 books for like, with shipping and everything, it was like over $23. And now like anyone can go on Amazon, and I can't sell. I have this stack of like 20 books left I can't sell because everyone can get it $10 cheaper off of Amazon. Anyway, you can get it shipped to your house before our next episode for $14. So if you want to read along with us. But the title is Priestly Presence, A Church for the World's Sake. It's published by Fortress Press. You may know them. They publish a lot of Bonhoeffer stuff. It's a Lutheran press. And they're pretty much wherever Christian books are sold.
Yeah.
You can get this. So yeah, the introduction, it kind of touches, looping back to what Sam was saying, tries to situate the book in contested times. And the funny thing is, I wrote this book several years ago. It just takes a while for things to get published.
Right? Exactly.
And it was at a time in our culture where, in America, there was like sharp political division, and this is growing out of the Trump presidency, which was polarizing people from one another, right on the heels of Black Lives Matter and how different people were handling that as Christians was polarizing within the church, right on the heels of the Me Too movement, which was stirring up some really strong convictions about the church's witness and activism, and how is the church part of the problem? How is the church part of the solution? And COVID, which was like there's the perfect storm of these issues that were flaring up in our culture, and so I really wanted to say that somehow as a church we've got to pull together during these times, right? And because the opposite was happening, and so as I was dreaming up the idea of writing this book, because the idea, so my conviction, the thesis, part of the thesis behind the book is that having a better approach to the political, social issues that divide the culture. I mean, some people are trying to find the right party to be a part of, or this perfect stance of balancing yourself perfectly between the two parties, or, being anti all parties, or something like that, where the locus of how we situate ourselves is determined by the current options offered by the wider culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that a path forward for Christians is going to be, let's ground our sense of how God has postured us in relation to the world in our own story of the scriptures, right? And a paradigm and a framework that does justice to the kind of place God has. That's where we're going to find unity. If we start with the world's options, however we interact with them, we're going to find ourselves on opposite sides. And the cool thing about the scriptures, it's like the one thing Christians from all traditions have in common. And if we can come up with an approach to facing social issues that grows out of our identity in the scriptures, that's our best attempt to have unity. And so now, why now, we were talking about before the episode, why now is kind of a timely moment for us to renew these conversations, because I think the COVID stuff has died down some.
For the most part, it kind
Would
of
you say?
Yeah, and well, it depends what you mean by die down.
Like the social distancing and the people who hate
that's-
people because they won't wear masks.
Well, I don't know if that's died down. Well, yeah.
Yes, mostly it has. Like, I won't say completely, because every now and then it wants to rear its head, but I'd say for the most part, it's become kind of a non-issue.
I mean, I'm still waiting for an apology from the lady who yelled at me at the dentist office. I haven't received that. I haven't received that yet. But when that happens, then it'll be over for me.
All right, there you go.
And I feel like the Biden presidency has settled things down a little bit, where people were really rattled during the Trump presidency. Like, it was a very turbulent time. I feel like the Biden presidency was a little bit more settling as far as people at war over each other, with each other over politics. You don't think so?
I
don't
wish
know.
I could say that.
I don't think so. I think it was a continuation, but from the other side being in power, right? So
Yeah.
when
Maybe
one's in power, I think there's so much stoking of just emotions, in the sense of, there were a lot of things said about, like, conservatives that put them all in a box. Like, you're all white supremacists. Like, a timeout. White, no. Like, just because a person might hold a particular leaning doesn't. And so I think it was more subtle, because Trump is not subtle, but I still think it was there. It was just from the other side and more covert.
And it might be the people, like the crowds you hang out with, because I'm like we were saying, Sam, I didn't think that it got diffused or anything like that. I think there was a lot of hostility, and a lot of it came from, like, with Biden, his age, and he was just making lots of mistakes. He was just mentally struggling, which is normal for anybody. I'm not finding fault with the guy. You get old and you struggle with stuff, and that just became the fodder that his opponents were using to go after him on a regular basis. And I got to hear a lot of that from people. And so, yeah, he was supposed to bring normalcy. Well, I think the normalcy is two opposing parties who will use anything they can to go after each other.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I think everything gets politicized. So a tragedy happens, and now we're going to use it to leverage something, like something that you want to have happen. And you say, see, if you'd only followed my advice and my bill and my whatever, then this wouldn't have happened. And, like, wait a minute, people have just died. Could we not talk about that for a minute? And so I think that's still going on, regardless of who's in power and whatever. It's just
I agree with all that.
Okay.
I just feel like the temperature went down. No,
I think
maybe it is my circles.
I think it feels that way because Trump is so forward with his
So
speech,
loud.
right? That it seems like it's always in your face, but that doesn't mean the feelings aren't still there when it gets reversed. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, nonetheless,
I say that all to say,
Right.
now we're a week away
And
from
we're back at it, yes.
we're a week away from another Trump presidency,
Right.
and that means it's quite possible that things are going to flare up again.
Yeah.
And so the context that I wrote originally came up with this has changed, but now it feels very much the same
A
again.
little full circle. Yeah.
Yeah, it does very much feel full circle. And there will be, I'm sure, as political positions start changing, as laws start changing again, as foreign policy begins to shift, people are going to be, tidying up to their side, right? And the question is, can we do better this time? Like, can this Trump presidency, can the church be more united, even if the division in society is going to continue to happen? As I was writing the introduction to this book, I just put a note out on Facebook saying, hey, to my Christian friends out there, share with me any stories you have about how the social and political tensions in the world have negatively impacted or how your church has handled them or negotiated them. I didn't necessarily tilt it toward, good things or bad things, right? I just kind of put out there, how has the social upheaval impacted your congregations? And I got a series of emails that were really chilling and sobering. And I'll just share a couple of
I'll just
excerpts from them.
when I read these, I'm like, oh my! I just my heart dropped because I felt for the people who these things happened to.
Yeah, and so I have these bullet point summaries of 4 different testimonies that came my way, and these were not from strangers out there. These are from people I know.
Yeah, right.
I know people in all of these situations who experienced them firsthand, and not only that, but I would say they are friends, pretty strong friends. So in one situation, a pastor votes the wrong way in an election. That draws fire from parishioners of the opposing political party. The pastor nearly loses his job, and the church fractures. Mm-hmm. That's one thing that happened over an election.
Yeah,
right? Who voted for whom?
And I think I know people on both sides who voted for both candidates where that happened, right? Which you assume it's one candidate they voted for, but it's not. It's on both sides.
Right.
Yeah. So another situation, a group of elders took an unpopular stance on COVID-19. Half the church left, all the paid staff resigned, and the congregation falls apart. Mm. And that was a COVID casualty.
Yeah.
The first thing was an election casualty, and this was a COVID casualty. And there are different versions of this that different churches have experienced. In another situation, a member objects to a patriotic service that the church had. It must have been like a 4th of July or something like that. The minister pursues a creative solution that strives to maintain unity. And then the elders dismiss the minister for being a communist.
Oh, God, for being a communist. Wow.
Yep.
Oh, my gosh.
So apparently to not be a full-throated, patriotic church service on 4th of July, to not do that, you must be a communist. Another situation, last one, the preacher backs a particular war from the pulpit. That elicits mixed responses. He eventually resigns over the turmoil and the church splits. All right. Just 4 stories, and all of them different things, right? Like how, worship and politics mix, how we deal with elections, how we deal with a social crisis caused by a pandemic. These kinds of situations have all resulted in churches splitting.
Yep.
And that's crazy.
Yep.
Churches used to split on things like theology.
I mean, sure.
Right?
Right, yeah.
Carpet color also. But. And that was always the joke, right? That churches split over the color of the carpet. And I don't think that many actually did that. But
right,
yeah. Theological things were what did it. But see, some would consider those theological premises, right? So voting for a candidate who doesn't keep what you think are Christian ideals for them would be a theological premise. Now, we would say, I don't think that's how that works, but for them it is. And I think all of these things are they defend them in their minds theologically, but it's is it a matter of essential, not essential, or is it even theological at all?
Yeah, and I guess what I meant by theological is like the doctrine of the Trinity.
Oh, right, exactly.
Right.
Or
Yeah,
like these
baptism.
things are like ethics
Yes.
and social issues,
Mhm.
not soteriology, how Jesus saves us, or
Right.
predestination, or free will.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
are more, I guess, abstract, philosophical, theological, like who is God, what is salvation,
Mm-hmm.
how do we participate in salvation, and these are, I don't know, they're like how do we interact with, I don't know, the debates of the world.
Right. Yeah, it's different, but still connected, but it goes to show how I feel like we've lost our way when we're making those things so important, like those are the most important things that we need to talk about, as opposed to these other theological tenets that have been debated by brains throughout history, and so we kind of lost our way.
Well, and I think a lot of people are going with what they know. And they've probably been taught this. It's not like they just kind of pulled it out of the air on their own, but they've probably been brought up in their Christian lives to view these things as theological issues, that your political alignment is a theological issue, that your stance on like COVID or war or whatever is a theological issue. And they've had people make compelling theological arguments to support those positions. And that's why I think it's really important for people to hear a different opinion, a different view that's grounded in Scripture, that is biblically based, that's theologically solid, to say, I know you've always been taught that, and I understand that based on everything you know, you think you've arrived at the best conclusion. And I agree with you. Based on everything you know up to this point, you've arrived at the best conclusion. Allow me to introduce some new things into the argument for you to consider that maybe is going to shift the way you think. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. I want to be sympathetic to people who are doing the best they can with what they know. I just want to say, here are some other things that I don't think you've thought about that I hope and pray are going to maybe help you to think about this in a different way.
Yeah, and I don't disagree that these are theological
Sure.
issues. I think there's a difference. Well, there are the big issues in theology,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
and your stance on, say, abortion, or your stance on immigration policy, right? Like those are grounded in views of like the topic of how the Bible talks about the sanctity of life, or how Bible, whether it's the sanctity of life of the child or the mother or whatever, or how the Bible talks about aliens and strangers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like these are biblical topics, right? And so it's like, so they're biblical. People have biblical reasons to take one stance or another.
Yeah.
And so they are theological. I guess I want them to be located in a broader theology, not a theology of abortion,
Right.
but
yeah.
like a theology of the church's calling,
Yeah.
the theology, like ecclesiology,
Mm-hmm.
grounded in how has God called us to relate to the world, which is a place that has views that are different than the church's.
Yeah. What does it mean to be the church? Yeah. Individually and corporately.
Yeah, but you're bringing up a nuance that just is absent because we've grown up in the personal, individual faith
Yeah.
theology that
point.
has existed in America, and everything's individualistic, and we don't see things in a much bigger sense. So, like, if I'm against abortion, I'm going to make that my, that part of my faith thing, as opposed to, yeah, but what does it look like in the context of the church? And so, yeah, it's a constant pushback between these different things. Like you're pushing back on a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings about faith and the church that exist in America.
What
It's
does it
a
mean?
uphill battle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's
To
it
say
mean
the
to
least.
be a Christian? A lot of people call themselves Christians, and I love it when I hear that. I'm like, so glad that, you're wearing that title. But do you really stop and think what it means? Like, what are you committed to? What's the calling? What's the vision that God has given us? These are big questions that need to be answered. And again, I'm not trying to find fault with people who maybe haven't thought, as deeply about it, but that's why we're here. And if you're listening to this podcast, I think you must be curious about that. And so we want to have a robust conversation to help, our listeners grow in that. And then hopefully you can have conversations with other people who don't listen to the After Class podcast, but you can say, some smart guys gave me some information and I want to pass it on to you.
So that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to bring the lens back a little bit. And, we get myopically focused on this one pressing ethical social issue. And let's locate, there is what we think about that issue. And then there is, how does what we think about a particular social issue play into the wider calling of God's people, and particularly how God has called us to relate to the wider world. It's trying to paint that broader picture. Now, we're not the first to attempt to do that. This book's not the first to attempt to do that. One of the most famous attempts at kind of taking a step back and looking at the big picture issue of the church's mission is Richard Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture, which Sam has read, Ron has not read.
I've not read it.
But it's a book that's like 70 years old.
Yeah.
And Richard Niebuhr was, I would say, probably a mainline liberal Protestant who was, trying to help the church work through some contested issues about war and the church and society and social needs and poverty. And his typology has become a main teaching tool in universities for decades.
Yeah.
It's kind of been the approach. And so he basically, instead of using language of church and world, it's Christ and culture. But you could say, substitute them.
Was he an American author? Was he?
Yep. He's
Okay.
American.
I mean, his last name sounds German. I didn't know if he was writing from Germany, but I didn't think he was. Okay. I mean, and I think it's important, like knowing what the kind of context a person's writing out of is helpful to understand that person and his or her position. So, okay,
Yeah.
Good to know.
So he created this typology. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because this book offers a counter typology. Not a counter, but a different typology.
Right.
Like, I think his typology it's growing old. It's getting dated. Or it did a good job of describing the landscape 70 years ago, and it may have even been relevant 20 years ago still. But I don't think it really accurately describes the landscape today. And so next week we're going to suggest an alternative typology. But he basically has these four positions of how Christ and culture relate. And one is the Christ against culture. And he would associate this with the Anabaptists, like electricity bad, right?
Yeah.
Like politics bad, right? Politicians bad. Like Christians just stay away. Like cultures, that's like they're going to hell in a handbasket, and we're about the kingdom, and we stay as separate and apart from it as we can. That's his Christ against culture. Now, most Mennonites would say that's not us.
Sure.
Right.
It is definitely a caricature, right?
Yeah.
And really all typologies end up with some level of caricature, right? Because you're trying to stake out a big picture position. But I think we can all resonate with, people in our lives or people we know who might be Christ against culture types, right? Where like their fundamental stance is, I'm not going to have nothing to do with that because I'm a Christian.
Well, we all grew up in the decades of like anti-rock and roll, even though we all loved rock and roll.
Yeah.
We grew up going to churches like we have CD burning parties, and that, I mean, that's Christ against culture.
Album
right?
burning parties.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes. Album
CD smashing.
tapes and all the yes, the different format, 8-track smashing parties. You know what it might be for your generation. And so I think we're especially familiar with that. That facet of it, right? And we may not be like Essenes going out, or going out in the desert, the Qumran community, but there was definitely a us versus them mentality for certain things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when it comes to social issues, it's kind of like the world's got its problems, but we are a separate community and we just deal with our own stuff.
Yeah.
So that's one stance, and Niebuhr has no problem picking that apart. Like,
Oh, yeah.
Saying like, but we're here for the world, and we got to make a difference in the world, and we're salt and light for the world, and we've been sent into the world. So by the time you're done reading that section, you're like, yeah, that's not a good position.
Sure.
And then he moves on to the Christ above culture. And this is kind of the posture of Christians have superior knowledge about the world and how things should work. And so we should get ourselves into positions of power in the world so that we could deploy our superior knowledge on behalf of the world.
Yeah.
And he would say, like, classical, this would be represented by classical Catholicism and the Crusades and the medieval church, right, would be a representative of Christ above culture.
Yes, and this is the argument that I hear from a lot of people when I talk about my detachment from politics. Like, well, shouldn't we rather have Christians in positions of power making decisions, making laws than not? Like, because they're going to agree with what the Bible says, and we can not that they're going to force it upon people, but they should be in the conversation and they should be influencing, like, from the top down, and that's their argument. And so we often go round and round with that position. Right?
Yeah. It has ancient.
Yes, it sure does.
Ancient precedent, and it has very modern applications. As a matter of fact, one of the types that I'm going to present in mind is going to preserve this Christ above culture stance. I just give it a different name.
Okay.
But it's alive and well in the desire for a Christian America.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. It has some of these sensibilities. Another one is the Christ of culture. And for this is kind of like what we would associate with classical liberalism. It's, what does the culture need the church to be? Like, what are the highest ideals of the culture? And how can the church frame itself to be the answer to the questions the culture is asking, right? And so if the world is wrestling with issues of race, then the gospel centers on race. If the world is wrestling with helping the poor, then the gospel is all about poverty. And so pick the social issue of the day. And here, like in Friedrich Schleiermacher's day, this is to go back a few centuries, he was like the father of liberalism. Romantic philosophy was the philosophy of the age, and it's about the oneness and wholeness of all things and deity indwelling all things and everything being an extension, an integrated whole of the divine unfolding of itself, building on the philosophy of Hegel. And so Schleiermacher, who's a pastor, like, preaches a gospel where, like, the God of Scripture is the deity that infuses all things, and Christ is the unfolding and the development of the perfect religion that helps hold together all the ideals of romanticism, right? And so Christ of culture, basically, what is it that culture is raving about now? And that's what the church should be about now.
Yeah.
So it's taking its cues.
Yeah, it's not that that society is dictating what we believe. We're more contextualizing the gospel, what we're focused on, based on what, like I said, what society might need in this time and this place, because it's all related. And also, Schleiermacher is a great name.
Friedrich, even
Yeah, it's a fantastic name.
Friedrich Schleiermacher.
Yeah, and I think that's important how you say it. And and for us, contextual theology is important.
Yeah,
Like, we want
for sure.
to answer society's questions. We want to bring the gospel to bear on what our neighbors are wrestling with. Right, that's not the problem. So, but with this Christ of culture, it's that the questions the world answers become the center.
Yeah.
Of our theological project, not we have our own center, which is Christ or the gospel or the kingdom, and then how does that apply to issues of race or gender or wealth distribution or immigration? But like in liberalism, Christ is the form of those issues.
Yeah.
That is the gospel. That's what the gospel is all about. And so it's a stronger Christ of. And he critiques this one too, because it's like it's letting the world have too much say.
Yeah.
Right? In what, our center shouldn't change, but we should be sensitive to them.
Yeah. Well, we don't have to get into all of it, but like there's a place for that, because so many churches become like completely disconnected from the world. Like, you don't even know what's going on, what people need. You care about this one little pet thing. Meanwhile, people are starving, like, in your alley next to your building, right? So like you got to be aware of these things. But if you make it like now becomes all about that, then we've like sort of subjugated Christ under that, and that's not appropriate either.
Yeah, you can identify liberalism by comparing the news headlines with the sermon headlines. Like when they're the same,
Yeah.
then you might be in the Christ of culture. So another type, his final type that he presents as a bad one is Christ and culture in paradox. And this would be advocated by Martin Luther of the Reformation, not to be confused with Martin Luther King Jr.
Fair.
But this one is, it actually is somewhat popular today in certain Reformed circles. It's basically, they're in paradox because we both, we recognize that the world is complex and our relationship to culture is different based on where we are. So like for Luther, like in our family life and in our church life and in our private life, it's all about Jesus and the kingdom. And like the specific teachings of Jesus about love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you, small is great, great is small. Like the radical upside down kingdom is the ideal for our private lives and our church lives. But when we're in the public sphere, whether in education or politics or the market or the judicial system, the way of Christ can't be brought to bear in a radical way. You need to draw upon a higher law, the law, natural law, which God has wired into this creation, principles of wisdom that are accessible to all humans. And so you draw upon, and so it's still from God because it's natural and he's the creator of nature, creation. But it comes to conclusions that are different than what's taught in the Sermon on the Mount. And so it's kind of like we reflect the ideas of culture where we're in the public sphere, like the majority view of wider culture gets to inform how we act. But we're in our church sphere, then the Sermon on the Mount, the radical way of Jesus, is our guide. And so this is Christ and culture in paradox. We kind of reject culture in this sphere of our life, but we embrace culture in that sphere of our life. And so he dismisses that because it's kind of schizophrenic.
And hypocritical and
Yeah.
lots of other things, but that's fine.
Pretty easy to dismiss that one.
So he sets up these four types and associates them with different church traditions along the way and says, all of them got a little bit of truth in them, something good they're trying to talk about, but they don't quite have what we really should be in relation to the world. So then he sets forth his fifth type. He doesn't say it's his favorite. He kind of puts it out there as if neutral, except it's the only one he doesn't critique. But he calls that Christ transforming culture. And for him, this is the hero. This is, it's our relationship is not to be against or above or in paradox or of. It's like the world, the culture is weird and messed up. It's got some good things. It's got its bad things. Our job is to take the way of Christ and to transform the culture and make it better. And so for 70 years, that typology has been presented and everyone's kind of landed in the same place. We want to be transformers of culture.
Of course.
We don't want to sell out to it. We don't want to dominate over it anymore. Crusades were a bad look.
Yeah.
But we want to make a positive difference. And so everyone has kind of embraced that posture. And so that's how his typology kind of ends. And then the question for all churches is, how can we transform the culture in our time and place, right? And why I say this typology has become kind of outdated, it's because everyone kind of wants to transform culture for the good and be a positive presence. It doesn't really distinguish the different positions. Where we're at today is, I don't know, what does it look like to transform culture? What mechanisms are appropriate for transforming culture? To what extent should we be transforming culture? Are there certain aspects? There's a unity in rejecting the extremes of the other four views, and then there's a unity of embracing having this positive impact. But the real difference is, and I don't know any churches that don't want to make a big difference in their community and have a positive impact, but it doesn't capture where the tension is. And so next week, we're going to talk about a different typology of how we can relate to the world. And we're going to use what I call the fourfold office of Christ, prophet, priest, king, and servant. That these terms represent four different postures that the church should have in relation to the world. And like with Niebuhr's typology, each one has some strengths and weaknesses. But ultimately, as you can tell by the title of the book, Priestly Presence, the image of priesthood interpreted in a holistically biblical way might be one of the promising ways for us to think about our role in the world. So that's where this is going.
And we hope you'll join us for that journey. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the After Class Podcasts. After Class because
The best conversations happen
After class.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the After Class Podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio editing and mixing is done by Drew Nyquist. Episode images and descriptions are provided by Darren Harris.